Good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to today's video on 2020. And, well, this year and this election cycle just got absolutely crazy. And, well, I think it's important to talk about presidential succession in the United States. Because, well, Donald Trump caught the disease, and, well, at the end of the day, I think we should all wish him and First Lady Melania Trump a speedy recovery. And hopefully none of the people who haven't already tested positive for the virus, anything ill befalls them and they make a full recovery. This also includes the large numbers of people who, in our own government, who have announced today that they became infected, including Senator Mike Lee of Utah, and I believe the RNC chair. Now, okay, I'm just making sure I'm understanding this. Okay, cool. So there are now presidential succession acts. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that. I was just reading that to understand whether it was in the Constitution. The current line of succession was established by the Succession Act of 1947. And anyone in the line of succession must meet the constitutional requirements to become president, and that's also to serve as acting president. So we'll go through who the line of succession and who will be who fills that. And it's going to be, there's some interesting names on this. Some people whom may or may not be qualified. So, obviously, first off is the Vice President, Mike Pence. That wouldn't be a shock. I think, that is just, normal, right? Followed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, currently that is Nancy Pelosi. If we actually have to go to the third. By the way, I think there's only been one or two times when we've ever gone to the third option, and those were actually rare instances in the before January 20th at noon was established as Inauguration Day, and certain people didn't want to be sworn in on a weekend, so a president's term ended, but all the terms ended, but none of the new terms had begun, except for the president pro tempore of the Senate, who is traditionally the oldest, or not the oldest, but the longest serving member of the majority party. And the reason why this is a lot of reasons. But the basic job of the president pro tempore is they run proceedings in the Senate. So that's kind of it. Though it gets really confusing because Mitch McConnell does a lot of stuff like that, even though he's just the majority leader. Anyway, so the next person in the line of succession is the Secretary of State. And finally, we get to the cabinet positions. Secretary of State has always been considered the most senior of the executive departments, or executive secretaries, cabinet members, and is considered the foremost department of the U.S. government. And historically speaking, for a while it was considered the stepping stone to the presidency. And that department and that seat is currently occupied by Mike Pompeo, who is, of course, because he's a Secretary of State, the nation's chief diplomat, top diplomat. The next in line, this one actually surprised me that it was given such primacy, but the Secretary of the Treasury, currently, that is Steve Mnuchin. I think Mnuchin may be the only person. There's one or two more that have been in there for the entire tenure. But Mnuchin is one of the ones who has been there the entire time. I would have thought after State you'd probably want the Defense Secretary, but apparently not. Apparently, Secretary of Treasury comes first, then SecDef, and that's currently Mark Esper. This seat was originally, at least in the Trump administration, held by, what's his name? Jim Mattis. After that, you get the Attorney General, and that's William Barr, followed by Interior, and now we are done with the original 5 departments, and that's currently David Bernhardt. Agriculture is Sonny Perdue. Secretary of Commerce is Wilbur Ross. Honestly, though, I would probably consolidate those 2 departments into Interior. Secretary of Labor is Eugene Scalia. Then there's Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is Dr. Ben Carson. And then you've got an ineligible person in Elaine Chao, who is a naturalized citizen and therefore cannot serve as President of the United States. She, normally Secretary of Transportation, would fill the 14th spot. Secretary of Energy is Dan Brulette. Secretary of Education is Betsy DeVos. And Secretary of Veterans Affairs is Robert, is that Wilkie or? Yeah, Wilkie. Robert Wilkie. Secretary of Homeland Security is Chad Wolf, but he's only the acting secretary. And then if you really want to go into it, there is some ambiguities regarding succession and inability and all this stuff, typically from history. And the first time succession was brought up was when William Henry Harrison died in 1841 and John Tyler assumed the office of the presidency. Now, back then, there was, to say the least, it was very controversial, and a lot of people didn't even consider him full president. And eventually the Senate did accept him as president. And this set the precedent that the presidency would fall to the vice president if the president died. Eventually they passed the 25th Amendment, which kind of set up what the it was a little strange, to say the least. But interestingly enough, 20 years later, sorry, not 20 years later, it wasn't that much later, it was, I think, 10 years later or something, yeah. Another Whig president, Zachary Taylor, passed away in office, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, assumed the office. And then, and we can even look at that, yeah, 1850. And then Andrew Johnson became president when Abraham Lincoln died in office. Well, was assassinated. Then James Garfield was assassinated, and Chester Arthur assumed the office. Then Teddy Roosevelt assumed the presidency when William McKinley died. Coolidge assumed the office when Warren Harding died. Harry Truman assumed the office when FDR died. Lyndon Baines Johnson assumed the office when JFK died. And Gerald Ford, of course, assumed the office when Richard Nixon resigned. Now, historically, there's been some interesting... For a while, there was... A lot of people said there was a curse of 20. Basically, every president who was elected in a year that was divisible by 20 died of some reason. In 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected. He passes away in office. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, he actually passes away in office, though he survived an entire term. Chester Arthur, elected 1880. 1881, he passes away. Teddy Roosevelt assumed the office when William McKinley, elected for his second term in 1900. Teddy Roosevelt assumes the office because McKinley died. Calvin Coolidge assumed the office when Warren Harding, who was elected in 1920, died. FDR was elected in 1940. He passed away in 1945. And Harry Truman assumed the office. JFK, elected in 1960, passed away. And the curse was finally... I'm not superstitious, if I'm 100% honest. But it almost happened again with the president who was elected in 1980, Ronald Reagan, when someone tried to assassinate him. Reagan was shot, but he lived. And then in 2000, if we remember, George W. Bush was elected, and in the September 11th attacks, the White House was actually targeted. But it was never the White House was supposedly one of the targets, but Bush wasn't there. So some people still say that there is a potential for a curse. Now, two vice presidents have assumed the office of presidency because of nuances in 25th Amendment, where a president can, say, listen, I'm undergoing a medical procedure, and because I'm going to be sedated, I can't carry out the duties during this period of time. H.W. did it in 1985 when Reagan was undergoing a medical procedure. Dick Cheney did so twice. I believe it was actually for colonoscopies for W. And what Cheney did was he just sent letters to his family to say, hey, I assume the office of the presidency. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there have been times when lower down offices have assumed the presidency because the vice presidency was vacant at the time, right? Yeah. Now, Vice President Andrew Johnson was targeted during the Lincoln assassination, or at least supposed to be targeted, as well as Secretary of State William Seward, and there was actually rumors that General U.S. Grant was a target. The history is a little bit muddy on that one, but I did know about this before I read the Wikipedia article. Of course I did. Let's see. Now this would have been interesting in the during the 70s during the Watergate scandal. Spiro Agnew resigned, and with the unexpected departure, and if Nixon had been removed from office or resigned before the vice presidency had been filled, Speaker of the House Carl Albert was suddenly in line, right? And Albert was also next in line when Ford assumed the presidency in '74. And then Ford chose Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. Now, there have been situations where the vice presidency has been vacant for a time, and sometimes long stretches of time. For example, President Madison, his vice president George Clinton passed away during the War of 1812 of all times, and William Crawford would have been the person to be next in line of succession, at least using modern standards. And then, insanely, Langdon Cheves would have been after the death of Elbridge Gerry, who was vice president again under Madison of all in the War of 1812. And there was also a vacancy of the office of President pro tempore of the Senate. Then very quickly, John Gaillard was elected president pro tempore. But Madison never appointed a vice president for the rest of his term. During the Jackson administration, John Calhoun resigned as vice president, and the president pro tempore, Hugh Lawson White, was next in line. And I'll go through some of the interesting ones. There was Samuel Moore, president pro tempore, tempore. Now, there was actually a time when there was no one who would succeed, and this was during the Arthur administration, technically. Garfield had died, President Chester Arthur had assumed the presidency, and there was a vacancy in the office of President pro tempore of the Senate and Speaker of the House, which is insane. And then during the Cleveland administration, both of those offices were vacant, as well as his vice president passed away. And this gets insane. But Secretary of State for a while was considered next in line, followed by Speaker of the House eventually. And you can see various different situations. Also, Here's a fun one. Charles Evans Hughes. He had a very interesting career where he was a judge. Wound up getting himself onto the Supreme Court. Then he resigned from the Supreme Court to run for president. Then he was in. Then he wound up being in the as the Secretary of State, and eventually he wound himself back onto the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice. That's a fun historical fact right there. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. I hope you all enjoyed. See you all next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.